Thank you. So I'm the hygiene principal at BHP, and supported in that role by a hygiene specialist, and her name's Verity May, and also the HSC team more broadly. But in most of the initiatives for hygiene, we need a lot of commitment and support, and at Broadmeadow, where I work in particular, I think that's very evident through the support we get from the SSE, Mick Thomas, and most of the leadership team at that particular site. I'm encouraged by the maturity of the organisation, having worked across various sectors before. I believe their processes are quite mature, and they've got an accountability as well. So, if you're assigned certain tasks, there's a high level of accountability for all personnel to actually stand up and make sure that tasks get completed. And it's particularly relevant to this presentation today. So today I'd just like to take you through BHP's approach to the control of airborne contaminants, how we basically identify and implement the controls required, and also the steps we take to verify that those controls are actually working and effective in keeping exposures to acceptable levels. Hopefully at the end of the day I might sort of convey the idea that it does take a considered approach. It has to be planned, it requires a lot of commitment, and it's okay to come up with ideas and have them implemented, but it's really that sustainability of those ideas and making sure that they are continually being effective in reducing exposures, and that's probably one of the key challenges at this point. And I think that's probably a challenge for most of us. It's just getting that implementation, fairly solid and sustainable and effective. All right. So, what do we stand for? Health and safety is central to the. Just going on. I've got to do that, do I? Yeah. Okay. So, health and safety is sustainable to the is central to the sustainability of our operations. And this commitment is embedded in our charter as one of the key values. So we have a value in there called sustainability. It's also picked up within our HSE framework, which is also critical, protecting the long-term health of our employees. And as part of that as well, we've got the company standards, the regular reporting of leading and lagging indicators to the ELT as well as to the board. And we have a global position statements, maturity curves that track our progress and basically determine where we want to be. Are we going to be a global leader or a sector leader or an industry leader for different hazards? And also the public health targets are tied into the KPIs for our ELT team as well. As I said, I've been in the role for about 5 months, so I'm coming up to speed with a lot of the, the strategic aspects within BHP. So excuse me if I don't always get it correct. I'll just try as best I can. So BHP's commitment is what we have done is we continually revise our OELs. So we get expert, opinion from outside BHP. To help us determine what are the acceptable OELs. And for, say, for diesel particulate, for instance, at the top there, we had a review done by medical professionals in the UK, and they basically gave us the direction that we should be achieving to maintain diesel emissions to as low as technically feasible. And so at this point in time, we've got an exposure limit, which was, I was reasonably impressed by, of 0.03 milligrams per cubic metre, and the industry standard is 0.1, so we're well below that, and that's what we use for basically as a trigger for investigations and such like. So if there's an exceedance of that value, then we'll basically make sure that an investigation is undertaken. I hear also that there could be a view to going down further to 10, 0.01 milligrams per cubic metre, and that's approaching the limit of detection. So there's a lot of investment at this point in time at looking at ways to reduce exposure to DPM. Silica and coal dust, we had internal limits for coal, respirable coal, which was it was set at, it's always been below the regulatory standard, but as of the 1st of July, the level dropped from, I think it was 2, we dropped it to 2 and went to 1.8, but now we dropped it to 1.5. So that gets shift adjusted for a 12-hour shift to about 1.37 milligrams per cubic metre. So that came in effect as of the 1st of July. And for silica, we were aiming to drop it down to 0.05 and implement that by July next year. But as you know, there's been regulatory changes and they've been downward revised. So now basically the statutory limits align with our current internal limits for those two particular hazards. So we'll continue to work towards trying to reduce these limits and exposure to the workforce as technology enables, and hopefully through forums such as this and possibly others as well, we'll be able to share ideas and thinking about how we might be able to progress some of these more technically challenging controls. Okay. Now, just going to the journey that we've been on for the last 3 years, with the, I guess it started about 3 years ago, and I certainly wasn't there, but a lot of work was undertaken in those early years or about 3 years ago, to develop the policy framework around how we're going to reduce exposures to particularly things like respirable dust, silica and DPM. And so the policy framework was established, and that part of that consisted of the charter, but as well as performance standards and other documents. But in order to help the site operational people to identify their risk activities, and as well as to ensure that they have the appropriate controls, a number of, tools were developed. One of them was the catalogue of controls, and also a risk analysis template. And with those documents in their back pocket, and also, it was important to identify what segs had the higher type of exposures, and we did that basically by using the 95% upper confidence limit. And if that exceeded the OEL, for that particular monitoring period, then those segs were identified as ones that required to have exposure reduction plans or some sort of plan in place to make sure that they maintain their levels or exposure to the workforce to acceptable levels. So a lot of the operational people, they identified, once they worked out which segs required to have the exposure reduction plans, there was a need to have workshops. They had plan leads or plan owners were identified, as well as leads for the various plans. And they set about having the workshops and starting to identify not only the existing controls for some of their riskier activities, but also the type of additional controls that may be required to further reduce their exposures. I recently was involved with the surface drillers out at Broadmeadow. I thought the template for the exposure reduction plan was quite useful. It gave a lot of direction. You populate the existing controls, and you start to work through, well, how are we going to improve exposures within that particular seg? And at the end of it, a lot of the actions were assigned to the personnel required to do the work, so it's important that they have the ownership. And there's also a requirement in the document that we track progress against the various actions, and that those progress reports are provided back to our senior leadership for their information, but also to make sure that we're progressing, and if there's any roadblocks, then maybe they can assist us in overcoming those. So the exposure control plans have been in place, or exposure reduction plans have been in place now. It's not to say that, if we get a situation where it's been determined that an additional plan will be required, then we'll make sure that those plans are implemented. And sometimes if we get, say, 2 or 3 exceedances and we're trending in the wrong direction for a particular seg, it might be, well, we should go through this exposure reduction planning process just to make sure that we can bring that particular activity back into control. As part of this whole process too, 3 years ago, a lot of the technical specifications were done as well to help the procurement process for any of the, particularly with the earth-moving equipment, heavy earth-moving equipment and such like. So those specifications were done, and then the whole intro to site sort of processes and everything else that needed to support that at the operational level. In addition to the control plans, we sort of have a whole range of different activities to make sure that we're complying with the requirements of those plans. Exposure monitoring is important, and as part of that as well, that's just basically confirming or verifying that our controls are effective. And as in addition to that, sort of exploring ways that we can utilise real-time monitoring to provide that sort of immediate sort of information to the workforce as to whether the controls are effective or whether they should be introducing further controls. So the next 2 slides, our approach, and I think most of you would be aware of the hierarchy of control. I won't go through all the individual controls that have been sort of implemented over the last few years, but this one's in respect to DPM. I think something that sort of is a standout for, and it might happen at other sites as well, but for Broadmeadow in particular, having electric or battery-powered personnel carriers for use underground. I thought that was a fairly significant development. Higher tier diesel engines, so a lot of our load haul dump trucks, their engines have been replaced with a Hino package, which is a much lower emission than the previous engine type. Our emissions-based maintenance regimes is sort of like fairly critical as well, so making sure that following that particular maintenance, that before the machines go underground, they actually meet the emission specifications for that piece of equipment. The next one is really, it's a bit of a, I suppose, a surface mining bias towards some of the controls there, but again, just showing you how the various controls line up with the hierarchy of controls. At Broadmeadow, I think something that I found when I first went to Broadmeadow, I noticed that there's a lot of guys that were in the room adjacent to the hygiene laboratory, and it wasn't sort of until probably my second month that I realised this is actually the surface remote console for operating the shears. So they've got this surface capability now, which is fairly, to me, it's pretty amazing. The others there are sort of like, cabin enclosures. Some of these are sort of like fairly typical. These are the type of things that you would normally expect to see these days. I can't go into the detail on the intelligent cabin pressurisation systems, but if you have, if you see the slides and you have any questions in relation to any of these controls, I guess this is part of the sharing aspect. If you let me know, or one of the BHP representatives here know, I'm more than happy that we can put you into contact with the right people so you can explore that a little bit further. Control verification. So as I said at the beginning, this is a fairly critical component to make sure that our controls that we've put in place and our system that we've put in place is sustainable. To do this, it's been embedded within the BHP risk management framework. So terms like risk owners and control owners are used. I'm a control owner for overexposures, and I've got my superintendent, which is Dennis. He basically is the risk owner. But as a control owner, I have obligations to make sure that I verify that the controls are in place, and I have test plans that people are required to adhere to determine whether we're actually complying with that particular requirement. Also, our field leadership. I would have to say that BHP, for me anyway, having worked across a number of different industries, that the BHP approach to field leadership is quite mature. It's got a lot of resources to help people undertake their field leadership. There's a lot of coaching put into that, and it's just not like a piece of paper to conflict. It is actually a commitment that you get from the senior management, at least my senior management, to make sure that we're doing these field leaderships as they're intended. So we have things like layered audits, critical control observations and planned task observations and TTTs. But yeah, so for me, and then the number of, we all get assigned a number of field leadership tasks that we have to complete, and they're tracked and they're reviewed by the senior management as well within your particular operational area. And I find that really quite refreshing in some respects. Also, a big part of the control verification, and we're only beginning on this journey, is to do with the real-time monitoring. And most of you probably are familiar with who in the audience basically has some involvement with real-time monitoring at their site? No? Okay, so I guess the advantage of real-time monitoring is that, like at Broadmeadow, for instance, we have the PDM 3700s, and I know that other sites, Anglo sites, would be using those particular. They're a respirable dust real-time monitor that the guys can wear on their hips, and they have a little cyclone that they can wear on their near their lapel. But the value of that is that instead of having to wait, say, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for results to come back from the labs, you're able to actually, the worker, say we use them particularly for our shearer operators, but they're able to actually get an indication as to the level of exposure during that shift. So, for instance, if they hit 80%, they know that they're sort of like getting close. So in addition to our standard task rotation, if they were into their particular, say 4-6 hours on the shearer, and their results were starting to pop up to about 80%, then they would need to be rotated out of that particular task. That's just the shearer operator wearing the actual PDM. But what we also have at BHP and other sites, but particularly at Broadmeadow, is that we have a dashboard. So, and I haven't seen this before, and I think it's a huge step in the right direction, and I think all sites should be looking at doing something similar. But with the PDM 3700s, for instance, the guys, it's embedded in there. The wonderful thing about this is that the shearer operators and the longwall superintendents, they own the issue. And so that they basically ensure that the operators have the necessary training, say for the UPEE, but the guys actually go into the lab, they take the PDM 3700, they change the filter, okay, they can then check it out, but then they check it back in, they plug it back in, so the data is automatically uploaded, and then we get a little PI dashboard, and the guys are actually able to see not only the activity of the shearer throughout the shift, but also what the level of dust was over that shift as well. So they'll see the 15-minute type of rolling average, and they'll also see the TWA. And, I think that's a huge step in the right direction. We also, we have a PINSAR, which is a DPM static monitor that we're going to locate down near the longwall. But the PINSAR unit basically is just DPM. One of the challenges for both things like the PINSAR, it's a static monitor, but we also have another one that we're going to install probably in the next, I would hope in the next month or so, is the Trollex, which is also it's an ambient dust meter. But although these devices are fantastic and they provide us with real-time monitoring information, at this point, because they're not your standard method of determining what your personal exposure is, we're still working through how best to use the information from this equipment to inform our operational practices. And we're basically working right now, so we've got the PINSAR unit it's just been taken off the last long wall. It's going to be installed in the next long wall, but the PINSAR unit we're trialling. We already can see the opportunities for which it can improve our operational performance with respect to dust and DPM. And we're going to go through exactly the same process with the Trollex. We also have, I don't know how many people are familiar with the little AirTech. They're basically a personal monitor, but real-time monitor for DPM. And we've conducted trials with that, and we know that these work well, and they're also integrated into our dashboard as well. So, for all these devices, be it static or personal, our IT engineers have basically developed systems whereby that information can be downloaded, and then we have visibility with respect to how we're tracking different areas. The future of that will be, and it is optimistic, but they're hoping to develop advanced analytics so that they're able to predict what the exposure might be in the future. But we're still working along that way, so there's still a path to travel. And that's basically it. I hope I didn't send too many asleep.
Okay, thank you, Ian, for that. So just a reminder, if you've got any questions for Ian, jump back onto the Slido. And Ian, there is one already on there. Is there an ETA on the implementation of Common Worker Warn real-time intrinsically safe dust or DPM monitors?
No, that's to do, I imagine that's to do with the new model of the PDM, I think it's the 3800. Look, I know that there's been a lot of studies being undertaken through ACARP and the OEM to basically get that equipment, I guess, ready. But I suspect a year ago it was going to be somewhere in the new year, so we're expecting it somewhere in the early part of this year. But at this point in time, they seem to be still working through the hurdles. SIMTARS is currently still doing the evaluation of those pieces of equipment. So hopefully not too far in the future, but I couldn't give an ETA. That's what I might.
Okay. Is there any others? Anyone else hurriedly typing away a question for Ian in there? Give a couple of seconds. There we go. What was the methodology used to measure the efficacy of each control?
That's a very good question.
Maybe just stand forward, mate, into the...
Who raised that question? That's a very
Anonymous.
Good... Yeah, that's a very good question. Look, I can't... As I've only been here for 5 months, that's what I'd like to fall back on a little bit. But there is an expectation that all our... when we implement a particular control, that there is some form of validation done to make sure it works. I'm pretty sure that would have been undertaken to varying degrees. In terms... Bobby, did you want to... Yeah, no, that's all right. That's all right.
Thanks. If anyone doesn't know me, I'm Bobby Foote and been supporting the Broadmeadow team in HSC for a while. A couple of things that we do in terms of methodology. Dust, silica and DPM are actually a material risk for us, which means we actually establish a critical control framework and we have control verification tasks on our critical controls. So you do have to go through and say and look at what are actually your critical controls. So it's not going to be every control, but it's going to be those things that are going to make the most difference to actually reducing exposure. And then in terms of validating, are they effective? Then you put a process of regular checks and inspections into your system. So it might be checking, if sprays are a critical control, are they on, are they working, etc., etc. Your ultimate outcome is also your hygiene monitoring, obviously. but that doesn't help you know which control worked. So Broadmeadow team, for example, has been, you know, in the earlier stages really looking at, okay, if we add this one, how much difference does that make? And really regular monitoring can help with that. That's where the real-time monitoring can give us a real advantage, because then you can actually marry the data up and say, okay, when we had the sprays on here, this made this difference, etc., etc. So I think we're still building, you know, a really effective methodology to measure the effectiveness, but we're a lot closer than we were.
Not too sure whether that question related more to the validation process or the efficacy of them, but there's also different views in terms of how we might go about developing methods for determining the validity of a new control, and I think that is also still work being progressed. But I do know that the inspectorate is very keen for all sites to be able to demonstrate how they validated whether their particular controls are effective. So, you know, they're probably expecting us to have some sort of documentation showing what the improvement is. We can work towards that as well.